Welcome to my presentation addressing the question, why did the United States lose the war in Vietnam? The aim of the presentation is to provide a brief overview of that question and also to assess which of those factors were the most important. Was one more important than the other, or was it actually a multi-factor analysis which combined together to result in defeat for the United States? Do not forget, when going into any type of military history, there's always a human cost, be it with the soldier, as you can see with the typical 1,000-yard stare, or the Vietnamese people. The picture here was shown after the My Lai massacre, when there was indiscriminate killing of civilians, which resulted in war crimes taking place. Firstly, before we address the question, it's good to analyse what the question is saying. So what is meant by why did the United States lose the war in Vietnam? We need to establish actually what is meant by losing. US Army, the ADP, the Army Doctrine Publication 3.0, defines defeat as to defeat is to render a force incapable of achieving its objectives. So for our purposes, we're reverse engineering that as to why did the United States, or what point was the United States incapable of achieving its objectives in Vietnam. First of all, it's probably a good point just to briefly touch on the question, did the USA actually lose? As you can see in the top left, there's a picture that signifies the Tet Offensive. It's quite a graphic video. If you want to go and watch it, I just advise to proceed with caution. However, the Tet Offensive itself really affected the political picture back in the United States, which possibly led to the resulting defeat. However, the Tet Offensive itself, like many other battles, could be argued to be a tactical victory for the United States, because they inflicted far heavier casualties on the North Vietnamese forces that were sustained by the United States forces. The picture on the right signifies the United States going home in 1973. At this point, they established it was mission accomplished. So from 1973, you could argue that the United States achieved their objective, and actually from this point on, it was over to the South Vietnamese to fight off the North Vietnamese if war was to break out, which it no doubt did. And also, it was the first part of the domino theory. So with Vietnam being the first domino, Laos and Cambodia themselves did also succumb to communism. However, Thailand was known to have a booming economy. Malaya and Indonesia were also held to be examples of countries that have resisted the effects of communism. Whatever argument you make, however, this is the enduring picture. It's the US Embassy evacuation, where the United States evacuated members of the CIA and also embassy staff. As you can see, there's lots of civilians that are desperate to escape the country via any means, either via helicopter, clinging onto helicopters, or via any type of boat they can get to leave the country. It really shows the desperation of the people trying to escape what they perceived was vengeance that would be enacted by the North Vietnamese. It's also helpful to consider levels of analysis when addressing a question such as this. So individual group state system. Starting off, on the left-hand side, I've equated what I think are equivalents for the Vietnam War. So I've got the individual soldiers or civilians that are involved. The groups have got anywhere from the units through to the army at large, be it Viet Cong, Vietnamese or United States or ARVN Army. And then I've got the people, so it's also the people and the population of the South Vietnam who had an undoubted effect on the course of the war. For the state, it's not just the United States and the Vietnamese, both North and South. There's also the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which had a massive effect on the course of the war, which we'll look at later on. So starting with the pictures then, starting at the top left, you've got General Westmoreland. This isn't necessary to single him out, but it shows that the leadership structure within the military force of the United States did not come up with any clear objectives, and it was unclear how they were going to go about them, and it changed over time. So initially it was propping up a South Vietnamese government, then it was the body counts, and then it changed as the war went on. Top right, you got LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Again, it's not to single him out, but also he was one of many presidents. So starting with JFK is when I'm going to attribute the Vietnam War starting for the United States active involvement. starting with JFK through to LBJ, Richard Nixon, and then finally finishing with Gerald R. Ford. Some of these presidents didn't create the problems; they may have inherited them. However, it shows that the point of this picture is to show that in a democratic system, the presidents may have only been concerned with a 4-year cycle, so their objectives and what they want to achieve was set with the ballot box in mind. Moving on down, then we've got a picture representing the CIA. The CIA initiated a number of coups and counter-coups and counter-coups, which ultimately did not help to stabilise the South Vietnamese government at a time when it's arguably needed the most. The B-52 bomber represents the blanket bombing of the North Vietnamese, which did not help to adhere the United States to the populace, and also it goes to show the changing objectives from installing a democratic regime to actually just inflicting damage on both crops, livestock, and the people in North Vietnam, which only helped to create potentially more animosity. And finally, finishing off, we've got the protest. This is one of those popular images, particularly in the popular media. It shows that the protests that took place in the United States throughout the late 60s and early 70s, these really had an effect on the course of the war, and they helped to affect the political change that was made. We're going to look at the military in a bit more detail. So we're going to start off in the top middle. We've got the poor discipline of the forces. There was known drug and alcohol abuse that was undertaken by the United States Army and the United States military in the Vietnam War. However, it may signify something else. So why was there alcohol and drug abuse? Okay, it might be that actually it's the only way the soldiers could have physically coped with the demands of conflict. There's no clear strategy. Actually, what were they trying to achieve? Right from the top all the way down, there was clearance patrols where hills were taken, and then those hills were then immediately given to the enemy, and then that hill would have to be taken again. So why were these lives being expended, and why were these lives being lost? The poor training of the forces. So yes, there were many professional military forces in the United States, but as the draft went on, the question could be raised as to the quality of the training those troops received when they went into battle. The draft and the draftees were a significant contributing factor. Not only did there's questions of their performance in comparison with professional soldiers and volunteers. However, back home it did affect the perception of the war and had affected the political view of the war back in the United States. Moving on around, they've got failing morale. You particularly agree with any protracted conflict, the morale of the forces began to suffer. And it leads into the next one, which is deployment cycles. So the US forces in Vietnam were subject to 12-month deployment cycles on average. And what effect did this have? Understandably, these soldiers often fought and wanted to survive, particularly as their cycle came to an end. Their main concern was getting home alive, understandably so. However, when that is placed above achieving a military objective, then can compound over time to really distort the end result. And similar instances can be seen in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars of the 20th century. One interesting question for me that it shows, particularly when looking at the leadership of the Vietnam War, is what to do when your voice is not heard. The problems they were having were repeated, but ultimately the doctrine didn't change and was designed around fighting a Soviet Union in the Eastern Europe theatre. The book cover you can see is one I recommend reading if you're interested in looking about leadership in the Vietnam War and how to affect change and what happens when poor leadership and good leadership is instilled. It's a book called About Face by a gentleman called David Hackworth. Now, David Hackworth joined the United States Army in the 1940s in World War II, and the people he served with were World War II veterans who undertook many battles in the World War II conflict. He really looked upon these people, admired them for their professionalism and their devotion to duty. He then went on to serve in the Korean War, where he saw similar factors that we've discussed previously in the Vietnam War about their deployment cycles, the training quality, and the morale of the troops. He really saw how this affected the strategic aim, and that actually was then a stalemate conflict. He then achieved a battlefield commission in Korean War and worked his way through the military. and ultimately he then began to climb the ranks in the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, he saw what he would affectionately call to his studs. Okay, so anybody that performed to an effective level as a soldier, he referred to as studs. And he saw a lot of these lives just being wasted and being lost because he believed the strategy and the doctrine that was in place was not suitable for the counterinsurgency style warfare that was being seen by the United States forces. He then went publicly on as a whistleblower on ABC News and publicly informed that if the United States was to continue in its current guise, they would lose the war. As a result, he was removed from the army. So the reason why I spent time deliberating over this is because actually for me it shows that if the leadership structure is not willing to listen and willing to take on the advice of the troops on the ground, it can not only affect morale but also affect the outcome of the conflict. So readdress, it's good to always go back to the question as to why did the United States lose the war in Vietnam. I'm going to start with the South Vietnamese. We've already discussed the United States in detail. So picture on the top left you can see is President Diem. He was one of the first presidents and ultimately he was known as corrupt. And not only was he corrupt, he was a Catholic president in a largely 90% Buddhist country. He did not help to provide that stable leadership and stable regime that the South Vietnamese needed. Moving on to the right, you can see President Thieu. He himself was a later president in a succession of presidents resulting from coups and counter-coups. Ultimately, it's to show that there was no stability provided by any of these presidents, and at a time arguably when it was needed the most. So moving on down, you've got the Army of the Republic of Vietnam soldier, the ARVN, being trained by a United States soldier. There's two big questions here as to was the training and the material equipped by the South Vietnamese forces effective to allow them to combat the possible North Vietnamese attack down the line, or actually was it effective and then they now need to look internally at the reasons why they lost. Interesting document available to you is the presidential report by the Chief of Staff to Gerald R. Ford, very, very late in the war. So we're looking at early months of 1975, recommended severe change in support for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The fact it was done in 1975 really shows it was just too late at this point, and perhaps the result was inevitable. Moving on to the bottom left, you can see a picture of the Buddhist monk that immolated himself. This picture signified that the discontent and discourse within the South Vietnamese population was so high that people took drastic action, and ultimately, when trying to win the hearts and minds of a counterinsurgency operation, it did not help the overall strategic objectives. Moving on to North Vietnamese forces, the one highlight in popular media is the Viet Cong. As you can see, if you look at the gentleman's uniform, he's wearing sandals, he's wearing typical overalls and clothes that you might see from a Vietnamese civilian, a cheap helmet and a rudimentary sidearm. It goes to show that these personnel, whilst not equipped with many billions of dollars worth of equipment, they actually were very effective at what they were doing. If you look at where he is at the moment, he seems to be in some sort of tunnel or a ditch. They're very effective at using the tunnel system to combat the United States and the ARVN forces. In addition to tunnels, they also were very much at home in the jungle, and they were comfortable living and operating within the jungle on minimal supplies, which the United States forces arguably were not for the vast majority of them. Over time, it's hard to overstate how this may have affected the balance of morale in the forces and the effectiveness as the war progressed. There's also a lot of traps that were set within the jungle themselves, a lot of hidden traps which were laid with the sole intention of inflicting harm on the US forces, which again helped add to the larger picture. On the right, you can see regular North Vietnamese forces. Whilst the Viet Cong that gets most attention, generally speaking, the North Vietnamese forces were the ones that fought the army of South Vietnam and then made their way into Saigon. Despite suffering heavy and significant casualties, the fact they kept coming back with significant numbers certainly shows a contributing factor to the war. It's always worth remembering there's not just the forces directly involved, there are other belligerents involved. So you've got starting top left, you've got the Australians, who were a significant contributing factor to the Vietnam War, and ultimately the political will in the Australia was no longer there, which is why they withdrew an earlier stage in the United States. So moving on round, you've got the People's Republic of China, you've got the North Koreans and the Soviet Union. Each of these countries provided significant material assistance, but they also provided personnel and manpower to the effort. Some of it may have been open and known across the borders in China and North Vietnam, however some of it may have been more clandestine, but ultimately it had an effect to grind down the United States throughout the course of the war. So going back to the question then, why did the United States lose the war in Vietnam? Well, for me, there's two main standout reasons to why they lost. Okay, and these are very much at the broad level. The first one is the lack of a defined objective. What was trying to be achieved? Was it to instill a friendly democratic government? Was it to prevent the domino theory? Was it to defeat and destroy the North Vietnamese and communist forces? The fact we're asking the question shows it was not clear. And finally, an overriding factor for me that really does stand out at this point is the leadership, right from the White House through to the high levels of the military, all the way down. The leadership was just not effective for what was required in the war. It's not to say that they're all bad leaders. You may have had good leaders have bad days, bad leaders had good days. You had good leaders made bad decisions, bad leaders made wrong decisions. Some of those were in place through no fault of their own, and actually did the best they could in difficult circumstances. But ultimately, the leadership throughout the course of the Vietnam War needs to be, for me, discussed in detail when considering any reason why the United States lost. So that concludes the presentation. I look forward to the discussion, so please feel free to challenge in the areas that you feel are either more or less effective, and feel free to highlight any areas, any relevant publications or documents that you have found. Thank you.